And that was actually a reminder for myself. The session is being recorded and it will live on the Baker programming site. And Kiara will pop that link into the chat every now and again, so you have access to it in a couple days. So please feel free to rewatch or feel free to share the recording with your networks. And so right now, I'm going to hand it over to my student, Courtney, who is going to introduce our three wonderful guests for this afternoon. And then we're going to jump right into the program. So Courtney, thanks so much for helping out today.
No problem. Hopefully everybody can hear me. Again, my name is Courtney Rounds, and as Dr. Cook mentioned, I'm in her Critical Conversations class. It's awesome. And I get to present our three presenters today. We will start with Molly Brown. Molly Brown is the Reference and Outreach Archivist at Northeastern University's Archives and Special Collections. While Molly was in undergrad, she did an internship at a repository where she first discovered her passion for cultural heritage. Because of that, after graduation, she decided to join the Simmons University's dual history and archives management degree to pursue a career as an archivist. She started at Northeastern University Archives and Special Collections as a part-time employee, and while pursuing her MLS degree, she worked part-time there and was opening for the Reference and Outreach Archivist position. She applied, offered the position, and since then she has had the responsibility for providing reference for users and developing in-reach and outreach projects for the institution. Next, we have Athena Jackson. Athena Jackson was selected for the position of Dean of the University of Houston Libraries in February of 2021. She is also the Elizabeth Rockwell Chair. She joined UH from the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA, where she served as director for UCLA Library Special Collections since October of 2019, providing leadership and strategic vision to shape the future of special collections and archives and developing initiatives that advance diversity and inclusion as integral to academic excellence through the work of special collections and throughout the library. And then last but not least, we have Kelly E. Warren, who is a library faculty member at the University of Illinois at Chicago. She is assistant professor and special collections librarian there. In the spring of 2015, she earned her MS-LIS degree from the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. Her library career began as a graduate assistant for the Reference Services and Resource Department at UIC, and after graduation, she moved into her first professional position as Reference and Instruction Library for Prairie State College. In both positions, she assisted students, faculty, and public patrons by fulfilling their research and information needs. As the first Archie Motley archival intern for the Black Metropolis Research Consortium, she processed the Provident Hospital and Training School collection. Provident Hospital was the first hospital owned and operated by African Americans in the United States. She was also the Archives and Records intern for the Chicago Community Trust, a corporate nonprofit organization. So thank you three for being here today.
All righty, thank you so much, Courtney. And so, as I mentioned, we're going to go ahead and get started. And our topic today is radical empathy. And so Kali, Athena, and Molly and I wrote this article. I think it's been, about 2 years now? I think a couple of us had different jobs when we actually wrote this article. And we wanted to talk about radical empathy, specifically with folks that work in special collections and archives. And so as an introduction to the article and subsequent conversation that we had, I shared with them that in some of the work that I was trying to do, I kept running into a lot of barriers and just, like concrete walls at different libraries and different collections trying to get access to materials. And it felt to me that, there were some folks that perhaps, weren't well versed enough in being engaged in special collections and archives, and what was missing, right? Because we don't necessarily want to call it customer service, right? But there was a lack of engagement, a lack of empathy, and there was a lack of really thinking about what the documents and what the materials might mean to the larger community. And so, as you can see on the screen here, this is an excerpt from a landmark article by Michelle Caswell and Marika Safour. Michelle is at UCLA and Marika is at the University of Washington, both in their respective LIS programs. And they talked about what they thought radical empathy is. And when I proposed, this conversation with my co-authors, I really wanted to address the perspective as a library educator and for someone who, teaches aspiring information professionals. What can we do better to make sure that radical empathy is something that folks come out of their programs with, right? That they, when they go into these really important and critical positions, they know how to not only engage with their collections and with their materials, but also with the larger community and with the folks who might want to view and use the materials in their charge. And so this is another excerpt from the article. And again, Michelle and Marika in their article are talking about radical empathy as the relationship between archivists and records and creators, between archivists and records subjects, between archivists and records users, and between archivists and larger communities. And so in the article that we wrote, we had a really amazing conversation. What's in the article is not even the entire conversation that we had. And so grateful to my friends and colleagues for coming today so we can kind of reprise this article. And so what we're going to do is go through the questions that we addressed in the article. And, since, like I said, it's been quite some time since we wrote the article, if there's anything new or if you have any additional thoughts about what we initially spoke about, please feel free. And again, for audience members, we will have time for questions and answers. And myself, Kali, Athena, and Molly will be engaged in the Q&A session at the end. So this is the first question that we talked about. And for Kali, Molly, and Athena, how do we infuse empathy into the skilling or formal education of new information professionals? Kali, can we get started with you?
Hi there, everyone. Wow, I think we started working on this article in 2018, and now the world is a completely different place. It's been turned on its head. So to respond to this question, I think it's very similar, close to what I said in the article, which is that I think that a heavy dose of truth telling is what we need and what I would consider infusing empathy into the skilling or formal education for new professionals. I felt like my education, my library and information science program was wonderful. It was fantastic at presenting sort of all of the ideal situations. And then once you get that first, serious full-time position, it is a serious reality check. So that's my first initial response to this second round of this question.
All right, perfect. Athena, would you like to go next?
Thank you so much, Dr. Cook, and to my colleagues. It's so great to see you again and interact with you. And Kali, I couldn't say it as good as you did about how we've just published this article, and then there was this big switch in the universe, and I'm here for it. And I know that there's a lot that we're shouldering emotionally and with our own lives as we try to think about our profession. We're also trying to think about survival and a financial disruption and a medical disruption and society and the changes that are happening in our social context with respect to the events last year that people just kind of alerted themselves to, that many of us have known for our whole lives, were big problems in our country and in our world. To answer the question, I remember my reaction and my answer was to Kali's comments. So I'm going to continue. This is great that you let us go in this order, because I still believe that one thing that I learned in library school and when I first started in the career was empathy was still situated in kind of a homogenous group of people, a homogenous backgrounds of people. And it was very comfortable for me to witness empathy happening in dominant cultures in the libraries amongst each other. But I didn't really see it translate to, I was a single parent, I'm Mexican American, I'm first gen, all those things that I didn't really find in my workplace.
That would be nice. Thank you.
And so that part about how we define empathy in the current context means also reorienting our minds to the kinds of cultural backgrounds and visible and invisible identity that's in our libraries. And maybe your flavor of empathy was normative and status quo and reductive of other people's existence. So I think that's something that what I would have added to this is really emphasizing that.
All right, Molly.
Yeah, I would just love to reiterate everyone's holding space for the fact that it's been so long emotionally and so many other ways since this was all written. And I think for me especially, I was responding and engaging in this as somebody that had just finished graduate school and that had just had some, really fresh criticism and feelings about my library school experience. And I think that gets put into further context as I am more removed from my library school experience as a professional. And I think that, when we think about empathy and especially trying to embed it in an educational environment, I again, like the Molly Brown that was responding to this years before, think about the lack of responsibility networks that are taught to students when you think about information studies, whether it be libraries or archives. The presence of people both in records, as donors, as users, as researchers, as people that feel curious but are afraid to engage with the field. I don't think that there is a level of responsibility that is infused, and I think that is really key in empathy, and especially with my role as a white colleague in the library and information science field. There's a lot of responsibility and a lot of work that needs to be done with how homogenous the field is and how homogenous my workplace continues to be. So yeah, networks of responsibility, I think, is my short answer to that.
Love it. Thank you. As you were speaking, I remembered that I didn't tell the audience that our article is part of a larger issue on radical empathy, and it's in the Journal of Critical Information Studies. And so our article has been out in preprint, but and I think there are several others that are there in preprint, but the entire issue should be published officially soon. So it's, I love what my colleague said about, it's interesting about this, our topic, but also about the publishing process, right? So we did this so long ago. And, to a certain extent, there might be some things that are different in what we might say or write now. But I do think that, what we had a conversation about and what we wrote still stands and is very valid for 2021, particularly the need for radical empathy in the profession and in our educational spaces. So I'm going to move over to question 2. How do we prepare our colleagues better for the realities of a field that is not always as well versed in the necessary changes that need to take place for sustainable success and leadership development to occur for colleagues of color? And this is certainly very much still the case in 2021 as it was in 2018. Molly, do you mind if we start with you on this one?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, again, when I was responding to this, I was thinking directly with the ways that my student colleagues at Simmons tried to prepare each other for the realities of this field. And especially as we were navigating a curriculum that didn't engage much with social justice education or critical librarianship education. And so the space that I reflected on is a space of preparation and also a space of care and empathy was derail. or the Diversity, Equity, Race, Accessibility, and Identity in LIS conference that was held by and for students, and was managed and developed both by students of color at Simmons as well as other students in the field. And so I think that was the first thing that came to mind. And now as a professional, I think about the ways that we can support spaces like We Hear Space, and the Green Book for Libraries, and try to highlight resources that are discussed on library Twitter and archives Twitter, but aren't necessarily highlighted in deep curricula or even workplaces. I speak to students and to folks that want to work part-time at the Archives and Special Collections at Northeastern, and there's often a reaction of, there's all of this that I didn't know about or that I wasn't informed about. And so how do we more impactfully and in a widespread manner share these resources and make sure that they are attainable to people without having to wait for a professor to put it in a syllabus or to do that in concert with it? So I'm always thinking about ways of supporting resources that exist, and that seem to support people well, but also making sure that that information is equitably disseminated.
Thank you so much. Kali?
I am kind of, excuse me, allergy issues. I apologize. I am sort of stuck on this particular question. I mean, a lot of the questions that we responded to for the article, I'm kind of stuck on, because I think that, simply from all of the sort of traumatic experiences that we've had since 2018, I think that we need to find a completely different language. I don't know what that is, but as far as, preparing colleagues for the realities of the field, I follow up with the same response as I had for the first question, which is a healthy dose of truth telling. Like when I present at different conferences or lectures, I tend to start out with the sort of demographics of the profession. I had no idea, reflecting now on my experience as a student, I had no idea that the field was so white and that it was sort of difficult to navigate as a Black woman librarian. I think that one of the first interview experiences I had, I actually went back to Nicole and was kind of whining because I couldn't believe the hostility just that I had experienced just simply from interviewing, just simply from sitting in front of this person and interviewing for a job. So I think, sort of a shared experience, maybe a commiserating, maybe not, leaning toward the negative, but also giving a sense of reality of what to expect is, basically where we have to start.
Athena?
Thank you. Kali, like you, I'm rereading these questions, and Molly, your comments too, like through this new, like a new lens. Like it's almost as if when you were thinking about these things, Dr. Cook, our barriers were a little narrow, not because of your question, but we thought the space we could talk about this, and those barriers have moved, and the momentum and the pace of where people have pushed the barriers and made expectations. As a library dean myself, that is something that I think about a lot. I have told my colleagues often, if you're not watching library Twitter, then you don't know what's happening to your team. You don't know what's going on. There are so many, hearkening back to what Kali said, there's a lot of, Molly said, there's a lot of growing and sometimes often informal ways that we're educating each other. And how do we move that, like We Hear is doing, like the Green Book are doing, that we are able to move that needle to make those critical resources, canonical resources of our field, not ancillary, just to feel good resources, but integral to the growth and health of our field. So when I'm talking to the beginning of this sentence, how do we prepare our colleagues better for the realities? Those of you here who are, by virtue of being students, you're already my colleague. So I think what I hope I could say to you and those who are entering the field or wherever you are in your trajectory, that the reality is what we're going to make it together. As Kali said about being a woman of color, a Black woman, myself being Mexican American, Latina, Latinx, for long ago I was called Chicano. There's a whole drama behind how I've been labeled as a person since I was in kindergarten. And the same thing for all Black and brown people, to be honest, the labels we've received. And the constant was white, right? The constant was white, and that was what are, Anglo-American. So thinking about what that reality looked like, I'm hoping that we're shaping it. I'm hoping that I'm making the right moves toward that. But it can't just be one dean here and one intrepid special collections archivist there and one, community engagement librarian there, a diversity officer there. If we're all doing these very independently, we're going to stay on this sort of informal, feels good stuff. And we need to move it to canonical and integral, which it will feel good. But that's what I would like to do, is ask you to help me shape this reality, and maybe conversations like this start that.
Yeah, absolutely. The one thing I was thinking about when you were speaking is, obviously, since we had this initial conversation and wrote the article, George Floyd was murdered, right? And that opened up an entirely different part of the atmosphere, if you will. And thinking about what Kali was saying about language, I don't know that we have the language anymore for it, right? Because after George Floyd's death, we were supposed to be in this racial reckoning, and I'm not clear we actually were in a reckoning, or rather, maybe we were in a reckoning for like a month. When everyone was reading Ibram X. Kendi and Robin DiAngelo and posting books on Twitter and Facebook about what they read, but they weren't really applying, right? And I think that that's where that gap is to what Athena was saying about making things canonical and kind of decolonizing, what we have valued for so many hundreds of years, right? So, and I think I would add to what Athena said, you read all the books, and now we need you to apply what you read. We don't want folks to be, like faux woke. That's not going to be helpful. But we actually need folks to do the work, right? And so it sounds cliche now about, making space at the table for others, but it sounds cliche because it's still not happening, right? So we need folks to actually make that leap from the theory to the practice to get to what Athena was saying. All right, so for question 3, and we can start with Athena this time. How do we identify and address issues of power and gatekeeping, right? Because gatekeeping is really what spurred me to invite these good folks to write the article with me, because there's a lot of gatekeeping, even if that's not what we, actively call it. And are power and gatekeeping antithetical to radical empathy as we know it?
Thank you so much for that question. I remember reacting to this question from a special collections context primarily when I was thinking of the major work that still needs to take place, but I see strides in, and trying to minimize the kind of perceptions of elitism, othering in the special collections ecosystem. And then the assumption that everyone walking in, including faculty, including students, those you think are your academic shared lexicon folks, if you say, you have to sign in, you have to put something in a locker. I'm thinking of that as these very assumed ways that people understand how we preserve materials as almost prohibitive, as opposed to thinking about the why. We need to preserve these. We want to make sure the integrity of the collections remains the same. So we have to put some restrictions on the physicality, but your experience with them is yours. Have all the liberty you want, and interrogating these, asking us why we even have it, how much money we're spending on it, why is this important to us? I want you to ask those questions. So when I think about gatekeeping. And I remember Kali responded to my response saying, it's all about communication. When you're going to put a rule up, and I hope I'm not paraphrasing you wrong, Kali, but you know, when you're going to put a rule up, you're going to say something, communicate the why, and communicate the impact. I try to do that as a leader now. And for me, I have a lot of issues with the word power. Kali, didn't you say in the article, like, we need to define what power means, right? And that was like, for me, I saw that in our shared document, and I was like, whoo, I need to go for a walk before I reacted to that, because it was so good. Like, you just dropped the mic on it. And I think that's where I want this discourse would have changed if we had written this article today, is that the concepts of shared power, of sharing through being clear about your decision making. I do have a lot of power granted to me in my role, and I can decide how I share that. I do my best. I think I have some colleagues from Houston in the room and other places I've worked with. I might be over communicative, but I'd rather be charged for being over communicative than not ever sharing, right? And that part is very important to me. But I never believe that power is defined by the organizational chart, that the person on the top has the most power at everything and has the most social and political agency on their campus, because you're doing yourself a disservice if you think the smartest person starts at the top and works their way down. And so I want to kind of disambiguate the structure of doing our work from the perfectly defined ways we empower each other to be experts and do their work and do it well.
All right, thank you. Kali?
That was a wonderful response, Athena. Thank you so much. When I looked at this question again, I, of course, went back to probably what I was thinking at the time, which is, power and gatekeeping are sort of, they're structural. They're built into the structure of where most of us work, if we are already in our, full-time positions. So it's in the structure. But at the same time, power and gatekeeping are sort of benign. They can be benign or malignant. I don't necessarily think that power and gatekeeping are antithetical to radical empathy because of how, for example, how a marginalized person might use it if they are not corrupted, I guess, to put it bluntly, corrupted by the structure or the systems that are in place. So it's a fine line, though, I'm finding. It really depends upon, the colleagues that you have, the people that you work closely with every day, how power and gatekeeping present themselves.
And Molly?
Yeah, so I mean, Athena and Kali have already said it very well, kind of the notions and the differences of power that we see in our everyday lives. And I think our everyday lives at work especially, when I was responding to this, I think I said this phrase of like, what are the priorities of power? And I think recently, after a while in attending other conferences, I was at the LibRev conference, and Myrna Morales and Stacy Williams gave a presentation called Moving Towards Transformative Librarianship, naming epistemic supremacy. And I'll drop a link to the slides in the chat when I'm done speaking. But they talked about epistemic supremacy as looking at the knowledge that has been built upon and has privileged and given power to the ruling class or to those in power. And I think that gets to, Athena's point again of like, what do we view as canonical, and what sort of knowledges are being built upon power, or that power is building upon. So I think that both identifying the ways in which power, as Kali said, is benign is really key. And I think that there is a benignness in the ways that we assume we are all coming from the same book. We are all coming from the same shared articles. We are all coming from the same forms of knowledge or ways of thinking or ways of communicating. And are there other ways to bring out different ways of knowing that address, again, kind of the radical empathy notion of the systems of responsibility in which we hold multiple truths, multiple relationships at the same time. And I think that sort of complexity and flexibility can be antithetical to power, because I think power would prefer itself to be seen as a monolith, to be seen as something big and impenetrable. So that is probably something that has changed as how I viewed power. I think power and knowledge have been very important, especially as we got into kind of the book club issue of how people responded to the supposed racial reckoning that we did not have in June of 2020. So how does knowledge meet praxis as well?
And I also think, let me just follow up on that. I also think about the book club where a lot of the small bookstores were posting to social media saying that people didn't pick up their books. They ordered books, but they did not pick them up. So somehow, this work is attached to consumption more than it is actually doing something about it, being a part of the change.
And Khalid, to your point, there were other booksellers, particularly those that were Black owned or owned by other marginalized populations, saying how much vitriol they were receiving from folks because the books didn't come in quick enough. And it's like, it's not their fault that suddenly 8,000 people now want this book that's been out for like 4 years. And they would get these remarks like, you're taking too long, I'm canceling my order, and this is why I don't buy from Black stores anyway, right? So are they really reading these books for the right reason? I don't think so. But to Molly's point, it reminds me of the work that's being done by Dr. Beth Pautan at Syracuse University on epistemicide, and really getting at what Molly's talking about in terms of, whose experiences are valued and then held up as the norm, right? And then for every experience that is valued, there is something that is not being valued, and that's not always unintentional, right? And so if you are intentionally silencing, certain records or certain experiences or certain materials, the power in the gatekeeping allow the general public not to know that, right? I don't know what collections you all have in your institutions if it's not on your website, if there is no finding aid, if you don't allow people into your institutions, into your reading rooms, right? COVID notwithstanding, right? So there's like a very tangible way of gatekeeping, and then there's this kind of existential determination about, Athena mentioned the word the canon, right? The canon was determined by very specific people. And so, how do we take that back? And I think that's also part of the power in the gatekeeping issue. All right, so question 4. So what does empathy mean at this point in the profession? How do you feel empathy informs the work that you do? And where in your work does it come up? And so let's start with Molly this time.
Yeah, so I think, with rereading this question and feeling the weight of at this point in the profession felt pretty big, right? Because time and selves have passed. But I think especially at this point in the profession, after myself and my colleagues are returning on site after being remote and are feeling the weight of being in public services, or anybody that is feeling the weight of being in a more visible part of a role that provides services to people. I do think that empathy is really resisting the feeling of isolation, and into viewing a horizontal connectivity for each other's work. I'm finding that with new colleagues and old colleagues at the library that I work at, it's very easy to feel the hierarchy, and that sort of power kind of weigh on you. And so I think the work that I am doing with colleagues and with people that research with us, people that have interest about knowing more about our archives, is trying to make things more horizontal, to try to engage trust and try to engage relationships first and people first, as opposed to product, as opposed to information. and just being really caring and consenting about what people need to engage with. So I think that with empathy, there's a lot of consent work that needs to be done and a lot of care that needs to be prioritized. And so I think especially for me, it comes up as we're navigating people returning to the reading room, and the sort of kind of trauma of being a present body in any space right now in the midst of COVID-19. I think that's a lot of stress and difficulty of navigation, and people are exhausted with the multitude of protocols that exist and that people can't find perfectly detailed, which again gets to that point earlier of communication. So I think really good communication, documentation in multiple places is a great way to be starting to be empathetic, and to more aware of how people need to navigate the world right now, which is through a lot of ahead of time research, which takes a lot of work and time too.
Yeah, thank you for that. I just want to lift up that Molly used the word product, and we heard consumption earlier. So just, paying attention to some of the language that's being used, and how it fits or does not fit with what we're talking about in terms of radical empathy. Athena?
I'm looking at my response up here because I guess I always go back to empathy is very hard. I don't know if it's impossible because that's not my area of expertise, but it's hard to train in someone, right? It's hard to convince the value if someone just lacks empathy and thinks that I just need to do my job and I don't know why I should care about these things, and those types of reactions. So when I think about empathy, I do my best to begin first with the person, right? And where are they in the dialogue? How are they reacting? As I've moved in my career, I've had to make, I'm very conscious of the fact, especially in my job now, many things I say in the day creates work for others. And if I don't think about that all day, all damn day, then I could create all kinds of mess for my colleagues. And that's so important to me. So I'm very cautious, not, those of you who know me, I'm not shy, but I'm very circumspect intentionally about what I'm saying is possible that the libraries can do, because that can create a lot of what you said, Molly, like feeling the org chart weight on you and that power on you. I'm very conscious of that. So I'm not always 100% good at it, but I think the empathetic mindset is to just have that be in your center. I'm always an oversharer. I apologize. I meditate every morning. I put my intentions out there. And I always say, be mindful of your words because they're creating work for others, right? And so that just that self-awareness in the leadership role, but if you model that for your middle managers, for your associate deans, for your colleagues who are managing students, that is such a totally different dynamic. And I know that, right? They're like on the front line of empathy, of psychology, of support, of mental health, all of those things. And I'm so conscious of that. And then with respect to where does it come up in my work? I think it comes up all the time. I'm fine sharing my emotions. I don't think emotions are a sign of weakness. So I'm fine telling my team, this is how this moment's making me feel, or yeah, this is something I don't know about, so I'm going to wing it in front of 95 people right now, and I think that just humanizes me a little, I hope. So to me, it's maybe the empathy needs to start in that mirror first, right? Do you trust yourself? Do you understand what yourself is doing in this role? And is it something that you can be proud of, right? And then you move on to those interfaces with others. And as you move in leadership or even in your role, how you make your decisions, right? How those decisions impact others.
Yeah, I love this, what you said about, perhaps the empathy starts in the mirror. And I think thinking about how much can we as individuals do, right? Another conversation that's come out of the pandemic is this whole self-care, which, I have lots of thoughts about. But I think the good part of that is thinking about what we as individuals can do, as well as thinking about what we as the collective can actually achieve. Because to Molly's point, there's so many different pressures, that we didn't necessarily have before. And it really does shift that dynamic, and it adds a great deal of pressure, right? Because we're all kind of living this Zoom life, and suddenly, we've got more meetings and we're working more hours because everything is virtual and you don't have to move. And so there's a lot of different dynamics. So thinking about how we care for ourselves and our communities jointly. So Kali, I'm going to toss this one to you now.
Okay, these are all difficult questions to do a follow-up response on. I think what COVID brought on was sort of a way to try to make us slow down a bit. I haven't necessarily been able to do that because I am tenure track. So that has been sort of a tension with me, and, sort of looking in the mirror, as Athena said, showing, giving myself empathy. But returning to work in the fall, even in a, sort of a truncated fashion, trying to focus on those relationships and those people that I work closely with every day, and sort of taking my time responding to reference queries, and just trying to be kind to myself, because one of the things that sort of made me angry about the pandemic is that, for Black and Brown professionals, we were the most affected by the pandemic. So it was very challenging for me to, in 2020, to be sort of, to feel like I had no choice in whether or not I was going to return on site. And not only that, on top of that, my main role is public services. So to have to interact with the public, I will not say that my experience is anything like some of the workers that return to work at, say Target or one of the fast food restaurants. My job is absolutely not like that. I did have some choices that I could make in order to protect myself. But for me, it was trying to figure out how to protect myself, not only myself, but the students that I manage, that I supervise, and then also trying to manage. I know a lot of us saw an open letter, I think, that someone posted from the American Historical Association to the National Archives and Records Association. But it's been kind of a challenge to work with some of our researchers because we've been trying to, give them a level of service that is kind of, I guess, acceptable, but at the same time trying to navigate the pandemic and protect, the people that we work with or that we supervise, and also protect our researchers. So yeah, looking at this question, there's like a bunch of stuff that hits me in my brain, in my experience being sort of, I guess, the middle person here. The middle experienced person, mid-career person. How do I feel empathy informs my work? I think I addressed that. Where in my work does it come up? Yeah, I think I addressed that as well. And thank you, John, for posting the AHA letter to NARA.
Thank you for that. So in the interest of time, because I do want to allow for a Q&A session, I just want to show our guests the other questions that we did talk about in the initial article, and to Athena, Kali, and Molly, maybe, if you have any updates to these questions, it'll come up in the Q&A. So question 5 was, how do you ensure that your practice of empathy is indeed radical? And what do you see as the distinction between empathy and radical empathy in practice? And certainly the conversation has covered a little bit of this already. And the last question is, what about radical love, radical hospitality, feminist pedagogy, and other frameworks, and how, if at all, do they fit with radical empathy? So with that, I'm going to stop sharing so we can all see each other. And I'm going to invite Courtney back to read out some of the questions that may have come up in the chat, and we can open up for discussion now.
Okay. We've had some link sharing, and thank you to everybody for sharing the links. So if you need the link to the article or the slides, those are in the chat. And any questions so far?
Okay, and folks can
I'm gonna
also
put on the playlist though.
oh, very good, very good.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to. So we do have a question. This is from Sarah White. How do we teach the importance of radical empathy to not only students, but supervisors / administrators / managers who have been in the field for a long time? Thank you, Sarah.
And Athena, Kali, and Molly, feel free to just jump in where you were moved.
I'll jump in to that question and yield anyone to correct me as or emphasize something that I didn't. A tremendous amount of, if I'm hearing your question, if I'm trying to read it fully, Sarah, if I may call you Sarah, that you're saying people who have been in the field for a long time that may not see this as a driver of their work and what should be important to them and how do we infuse that? Okay, got it. So number one, if you have any management responsibility or even in your role as it is, but particularly if you're a manager, you have to model that. No one's going to do something that you just send as an email with a link and say, watch this video of these things called radical conversations in LIS and talk about it with your teams and then change, right? Like that's not really how that happens. So there has to be some modeling and some places where those who are reluctant can have space to talk about that and be vulnerable about that. I'm trying to do that I just got here in February, so I'm trying to do that now here, and I'm hoping that we'll make some great strides. And Sarah, I will say one of my rules for myself is I never talk about my aspirations about my work in a public fora. I only want to talk about results because I hear a lot of leaders just talk about what they're going to do, but they don't come back and say how they did it. So I will say some of my results are, I'm very excited about some recommendations from our Council on Diversity of Inclusion at U of H libraries about really tangible ways that leadership can take on that responsibility of the kinds of behaviors that we talked about today. And I'm looking forward someday to sharing with you some of those results.
All right, do we have other questions? And please feel free to raise your hands or unmute and ask your question. The floor is open. While folks are thinking of some additional questions, I'm sorry.
Someone has their hand raised.
Yes,
Yeah.
I just saw it. Is it Dendria? Let me know if I'm okay, please go ahead.
Hi, I'm very shy about this because I am not in LIS training at all, but I'm a library assistant in Tacoma Public Library. And I started as a page, and so I'm hoping this question makes sense. I am wondering how radical empathy relates to my fellow staff. So I know that we are in the midst of an initiative called Normalizing Conversations About Race. And I've been on a team to create a syllabus to discuss particular issues about race with our staff. But I'm wondering how that radical empathy can be used amongst ourselves before we share it with patrons. Thank you.
Before I turn it over to my colleagues, I want to thank you for the question. You are a library professional, so grateful for your question. And I think it's a really important one because I think that there is a certain level of hypocrisy that goes on when we say to the community, you should be doing this, when we haven't addressed the status of our homes, if you will. So I think absolutely that this applies to staff and should apply to all staff, right? We could talk about hierarchies, that's another webinar, but we need to be doing that work internally before we can expect to do it in any type of substantive or real way, outward facing to our communities. So with that, Molly, Kali, Athena, any thoughts on that?
I find myself often repeating myself, and I think that's just the nature of this conversation. I can remember one of my first presentations as a professional on, I think it was critical information literacy and culturally relevant pedagogy. And at the end of the session, a librarian asked me about books that she could read. 2017. Do you have a list of books that I can read? And basically I said to her, and it was the end, so it was kind of a throwaway, but I think this is very important, that librarians, white librarians, need to look at the people that they are working with. They need to get to know the marginalized people of color that they are working with. Put down the book and get to know the people that you are working with. And then I also shared an article that was in the, I think it was in the Washington Post, about white people's networks being basically composed of white people. You have to get to know people of color. You're not gonna get to know them in a book. You'll get to know, you'll learn strategies, you'll learn maybe how to address your superiors, your supervisors, maybe better articulate, maybe pick up some, better language to use when you're in these conversations. But please get to know the people that you work with who are people of color and of various identities. That's my suggestion.
And if I can just add to that, I've written about this, so it's not, an untold story, but Khalid did a guest lecture for me on culturally responsive pedagogy in a graduate class, and did this amazing presentation about using hip hop as an example in library instruction. And, she and I think we're the only visible minorities in that room. And the question, or the first response that she received, was, I don't think that's professional. And yeah, that's the reaction I had. And I think, again, it goes back to this idea of the canon, right? And what people value. And also the other thing that I always talk about when I tell the story is that the person that made that comment was a self-professed, feminist pedagogue, right? Was very much into feminist pedagogy. And it's like, well, how can you be into feminist pedagogy and ethics of care, yet think that culturally responsive pedagogy is unprofessional, right? So we can't be in these silos. We can't cherry pick. We can't pick and choose what we're doing, right? If we are in this work, we are in this work, right? So I would add that to what Khalid said. Okay, so there's two questions. I just want to back up a little bit. And some of this we may have already covered, but if you have any additional thoughts, please feel free to share. Abby wants to know, do you all as professionals in the field feel like your colleagues already have skills like self-compassion and empathy, or do we need to start there?
I would say right now, speaking from like October 2021, that I see many of my colleagues have maybe unlearned the skills of self-compassion and empathy, especially over the pandemic. And I think it also gets to like Khalid's point of giving yourself time also. I think that there is a lot of a push for urgency and things to happen fast and to happen well fast. And people responding to that without question, without pushback, that is a lack of self-compassion. And a lack of empathy, and also maybe a feeling of a lack of power, and a lack of bandwidth to push back. So I see those as all sort of interconnected issues that my colleagues and myself perhaps need to recenter on, and to think about not only how are you compassionate for yourself by caring for yourself, but how are you compassionate for yourself by reframing your work to be caring for others. I think it is a really important reframing, because again, kind of to your point, Dr. Cook, about the self-care being, both a good and also a whole lot of other things. I think self-compassion and self-care need to be reintegrated also as community care, simultaneously. So I think right now maybe a restart at self-compassion, Abby, is my answer.
No, I love that. Thank you. So Khalid, this is a follow-up to what you were saying, and this question is from Kiara. How can you convince such librarians to do this when you were saying, saying to white colleagues to look at your marginalized colleagues, right? And she goes on to say that perhaps some of this resistance is fear or being uncomfortable, but how would you challenge them to do it anyway?
Kiera, thank you so much for this question. I'm uncomfortable. I've been uncomfortable for quite some time. I shared with you an experience that I had with one of my first interviews that I told Dr. Cook about. I went crying to Dr. Cook about one of my first interviews. So I've been very uncomfortable in this profession so far. So my level of empathy for librarians who have a lot of power, my white colleagues, and sometimes, I've heard that they feel, powerless in particular ways, and I can understand that, but, I've felt really uncomfortable. And my position is still very precarious. I'm, tenure track, I'm assistant professor, but there's no guarantees. So you pick and choose your battles, basically. You know those people that you work closely with that you can commit to in certain ways. I hope that helps.
Yeah. Yeah, she thumbs up. And I would also say, to Kiara's point, I don't know that it's up to me or Khalid or Athena to keep, or challenge is one thing, but to continue to educate is a different thing, right? This has come up for me with some other colleagues about some other things that I've written about my experiences in the profession. And it comes down to how much more do you want me to do? In the sense that, the literature and what we are able to accomplish with webinars like this, or conference presentations, or other things where we marginalized populations, I will say, consistently put their selves out there, right? So it's there. So I would add to what Khalid was saying and to Kiara's question, to do some legwork, right? Because it's there. And to start there as part of that, as Molly said, as part of that, that restarting, that regrouping in terms of empathy and towards the collective, if you will. All right, so we are actually at time. I want to be respectful of folks' time. There are, I think maybe, I just want to acknowledge Kiara's question about challenging folks to step out of their comfort zones. That's part of, this work. But in any case, thank you so very much for joining us today. And my special thanks and gratitude to Athena, Khalid, and Molly, my friends and my collaborators. And I'm very grateful that we have been able to come together even like 3 years later, and still be able to be collaborators in this important conversation. And thanks to everyone in the audience. keep an eye out in the next couple of days for the recording. And also at the Baker programming site, we have, I think, 2 or 3 more critical conversations in LIS coming up this semester, and you are all invited to participate. We'd love to have you back. So please be well, please be safe, and thank you so much for joining us, and everyone enjoy the rest of your day.